Good morning. What a lively group. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much. My name is Jennifer Bernstein, and I am the CEO and William C. Steer Senior President here at the New York Botanical Garden. I'd like to open this conference today by acknowledging that the New York Botanical Garden is located in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. I would also like to start by acknowledging the presence of Daniel Garcia Pena, Colombian ambassador to the United States, and ambassador to the United Nations, Leonor Zalabata. Thank you for being with us today. Welcome to the NYBG Climate Week Conference, this year titled Nature's Shield, Harnessing Biodiversity for Climate Resilience. Biodiversity, the variety of life on Earth in all its forms, from microscopic bacteria to entire forest ecosystems, is, according to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, our strongest natural defense against climate change. The Earth's land and oceans serve as natural carbon sinks, absorbing large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. Conserving and restoring natural spaces and the biodiversity that they contain are essential for limiting emissions and adapting to climate impacts. Here at the New York Botanical Garden, we know that this work of restoration with and through nature starts with plants and fungi. And we are dedicated to advancing that knowledge globally and applying it locally. This commitment to biodiversity and restoration informs our scientific research and our conservation programs, our urban initiatives, including our urban conservation program led by Dr. Eric Sanderson, and our Bronx Green Up program. And it also guides our efforts to educate the public on climate change through our research guides, our public tours, our workshops, blog posts, and podcasts. This morning, I am honored to present our keynote speaker for today's conference, the anthropologist and ethnobotanist, Dr. Wade Davis, who has been called a rare combination of scientist, scholar, poet, and passionate defender of all life's diversity. Named the Explorer of the Millennium by the National Geographic Society, Dr. Davis has examined the connection between people, plants, and the environment in his research, writing, and films, most recently in the documentary El Sendero de la Anaconda, which is available on Netflix. In today's keynote address, Dr. Davis will introduce the peoples of the Anaconda, the indigenous communities of the Amazon, their culture, and their strategies for managing the ecological threats that they face. Afterward, there will be a brief break before the panel discussion, which will begin at 10:45. Now, a friendly reminder to please silence your cell phones, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Wade Davis.
It's always nice to discover what you're going to speak about in the introduction. I'm going to speak somewhat about that. You know, it's such a privilege to be here at the New York Botanical Garden, and particularly with the presence of Ambassador Zalabata in particular. I've been a friend of the Arhuaco people since I first stumbled up those mountains as a schoolboy at the age of 19 in 1974. And of course, Ambassador Garcia Pena, the Colombian ambassador to the United States. You're born somewhere, but you choose to be something else. And then one of the great privileges of my life was when I was made an honorary Colombian citizen. And I carry that passport very proudly, even through customs in Miami airport. It's also wonderful to be here to speak before we all hear from a panel of such esteemed colleagues and good friends, a panel named in honor of two visionary scientists, the very memory of whom leaves us all still tinged with sadness. It's really hard to believe that they've been gone now for nearly 3 years. Tom Lovejoy, whose daughters are here with us, Betsy and Kata, who coined with Ed Wilson the term biodiversity in 1980, passed away on Christmas Day, 2021. And of course, Professor Wilson passed away the following day. And the blow to science brought to mind the deaths of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, American founding fathers who both died on the 4th of July in 1826. These two men had that kind of stature. They're friends and mentors to an entire generation of field explorers and scientists, all inspired by the example they set, both as scientists, environmental activists, and advocates who work to protect the miracle of biological life in every manifestation of its glory. Biodiversity, as both Wilson and Lovejoy conceived it, is simply the measure of the abundance and fecundity of nature, quantified by scientific identification and the naming of species. And as we know to date, taxonomists have named at least 400,000 distinct species of plants, 36,000 fish, 11,000 birds, along with 1 million insects, 14,000 species of ants, 408 of which were named by Professor Wilson himself. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because in a nation like Colombia, one simply has to spin the compass to find new forms of life previously undiscovered by science. And though a brilliant taxonomist and the world's authority when it came to ants, Wilson understood the limits of classification. He always looked beneath the surface of things, and just as the tip of an iceberg reveals but a part of the story, the physical appearance of any life form conceals but a universe of inner potential. A single bacterium, as Wilson noted, possesses 10 million bits of genetic data. An insect possesses between 1 and 10 billion bits, depending on the species. He was so great at this. He could distill from science these points of wonder. If the information in just one ant he wrote were to be translated into a code of English letters and printed in a font of standard size, the string of letters would traverse 1,000 miles. If you took the DNA in each of our bodies and somehow were able to align it in a single row, it would reach not just to the moon, but to 3,000 celestial bodies equidistant from the Earth. And so Ed Wilson in particular was both a teacher and a writer who had a way of bringing biology alive, encouraging us as scientists to communicate its mysteries, teaching us just what words could do. He was truly a master of the wondrous. But in the early days, Professor Wilson did have one blind spot. In the late 1970s, 1979, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama completed his first ever tour of America, and his first stop was at Harvard, where he spoke in the Sanders Theater. That very night, Professor Wilson was introducing Norman Myers, a Kenyan biologist who had written a book called The Sinking Ark, one of the first books to anticipate the looming emerging biodiversity crisis. And naturally, all the faculty and students were across the way, lined up around the block to hear His Holiness. And kitty corner in the Lowell Lecture Hall, Wilson took to the podium, and in apologizing to Dr. Myers for the sparse audience, he said, and I quote, "If even Harvard students can't get their priorities right, and they'd rather be across the way listening to that religious kook, you know how far we have got to educate the public at large." Now, to be fair, and I must say I was the only student that night rushing back and forth between the two talks, but to be fair to Professor Wilson, he was simply expressing the kind of zeitgeist of the era. We forget now, in a time when we utterly understand that the same forces eroding cultural diversity are afflicting the biosphere. At that time, that wasn't so clear to people. Anthropologists tended to see the naturalists as elitist, and the naturalists tended to see people as a problem, indigenous people in particular. But critically, that divide has now been bridged in a way that would have pleased Professor Wilson to no end because he was a humble man, and he would have regretted those words, of course, were he to be still with us today. But we are indeed, as he did express, living through what he, I think, was one of the first to call the sixth great extinction, and the first to be caused by our species. But there is a critical distinction to be made. The biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis have become humanity's problems, but they were not caused by humanity as a whole. On the contrary, they came about because of a particular worldview relatively new to the human experience, and when viewed through the ethnographic lens, utterly anomalous in our human experience, not shared by the vast majority of cultures of the world. And understanding this dynamic is absolutely essential because it is the key to opening new realms of possibilities, generating the promise, as Father Thomas Berry wrote, of generating an utterly new dream of the earth. Now, one of the joys of travel, and certainly the joys of ethnographic research, is the opportunity to live amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel the past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that as we sit here in the Bronx, in the Amazon, jaguar shaman are still journeying beyond the Milky Way, or that in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit still resonate with meaning, or that in the Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember the central revelation of anthropology, and that is the idea that the world into which you were born, your social realm, does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one set of adaptive choices that your cultural lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is a voodoo acolyte in Haiti, a yak herder on the slopes of Chomolungma, an eagle hunter in Kazakhstan, or indeed a thunderhoof shaman in Mongolia, all of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other ways of orienting yourself in social, ecological, and spiritual space. And that's an idea that, if you think about it, can only fill you with hope. Now, together, the myriad of cultures of the world make up a web of social life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as is a biological web of life that we know so well as a biosphere. And some almost 20 years ago now, I coined the term ethnosphere to try to give a kind of organizing principle to this web of human expression. And I kind of define the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, myths and memories, ideas and intuitions brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is humanity's great legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as a wildly creative species. And of course, just as the biosphere has been severely eroded with the loss of plant and animal species and the loss of habitat, so too is the ethnosphere, but if anything, at a far greater rate. No biologist, for example, would probably suggest that 50% of all forms of sentient life are morbid, but that the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity scarcely approaches the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that, of course, is language loss. The day that you were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, language isn't just grammar or vocabulary. The language is a flash of human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of a culture comes into the world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social, ecological, spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages spoken the day that you were born, by absolute academic consensus amongst linguists, half of them aren't being taught to children. In other words, we're living through an era where half of humanity's collective knowledge is in fact at risk. Now, tragically, this is unfolding in the very generation in which we have finally come to truly appreciate the value of every human voice. Because over the last 20 years, geneticists have proved it to be true, something that philosophers have always hoped to be true, and that is the fact that we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. We all, in fact, are descendants of Africa, including those of us who walked out of the ancient continent some 65,000 years ago, and then over the course of 40,000 years, carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. Biologically speaking, race is an utter fiction. In fact, race comes down to nothing more than vitamin D and sunscreen. That's it. I mean, you think about it, how many thousands of years of evil and agony, enslavement and horrors, simply because of that incredible human conceit and misconception. I've got a friend of mine, Polynesian, a stand-up comic. He does the most incredible routine because it all comes down to people up in the north needing to get vitamin D from the sun and people down south needing to protect themselves from the skin, sunscreen and vitamin D, and that's it. That's all. But here's the extraordinary thing. That really proves the validity of the Boasian notion of cultural relativism. And because here's the important idea. If we really are all cut from the same genetic cloth, it means by definition that we all share the same mental acuity, the same human potential, the same raw intellectual genius. And critically, whether that intellectual capacity is exercised through technological wizardry and innovation, or by contrast, placed into the challenge of unraveling the mystic threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no hierarchy in the affairs of culture. That Victorian idea that we somehow went echoing evolutionary biological processes from Darwin, that somehow cultures also evolved, that we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized of the Strand of London, has been absolutely debunked by modern science, shown to be a colonial conceit no more relevant to our lives today than the idea that clergymen had in the 19th century that the earth was but 6,000 years old. And so the brilliance of scientific research, the revelations of modern genetics, has affirmed in an astonishing way both the unity of humanity and the essential wisdom of cultural relativism. And what this means is that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts to be you. They're not failed attempts to be modern, let alone failed attempts to be of another place. Every culture, by definition, is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the people of the world answer that question, they do so in the myriad voices of humanity, and those answers collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the coming generations. Every culture has something to say. Each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. But the challenge comes, okay, what do you do about that? You know, if you're a biologist and you identify an area of high species endemism, you can create a protected area, but you can't make a rainforest park of the mind. You can't preserve culture. We preserve jam, not culture. Culture is constantly changing. Every people everywhere are constantly dancing with new possibilities for life. And so many years ago, when I was recruited as an anthropologist, as an explorer in residence at the National Geographic as part of the institution's conservation initiative, the question is, what can we do about this? And at the end of the day, we concluded that polemics are never persuasive. Politicians follow but rarely lead, but storytellers can change the world. So we set out into the ethnosphere to find those cultural practices that we weren't going to sort of celebrate the exoticism of the other, but to actually zero down on cultural practices that showed this truth of the common genius of humanity. And so we sailed with Hokulea, to cite just one example, the Polynesian Voyaging Society, where even today sailors can name 250 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of distant atolls beyond the visible horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves coming across the hull of the vessel. In the darkness of the hull of the canoe, they can distinguish as many as 5 different sea swells moving through the canoe at any one point in time, distinguishing those caused from local weather disturbances from the deep currents that pulsate across the ocean and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. And the most extraordinary thing about this tradition is that it was based on dead reckoning. And dead reckoning means you only know where you are by remembering precisely how you got there. And it was the inadequacies of that methodology that kept most European transports hugging the shores of continents until the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer. But we know for a fact that 10 centuries before Christ, the ancestors of the Polynesians set sail into the rising sun. They reached Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji. Then they stopped for 1,000 years. And then they sailed on to Rapa Nui, Hawaii, Aotearoa, settling the greatest culture sphere in the history of humanity. And what that meant is a wayfinder sitting monk-like on the stern of the vessel, man or woman, had to remember every sign of the stars, every shift of the wind, every shift of the currents, every sign of the birds, salinity in the sea, and not only remember everything that had happened over a 3-week journey, but the order of its acquisition, because if that broke, that stream of memory, the journey could end in disaster. So indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you'd get is Polynesia. So this anthropological, even ethnological perspective allows us to look at our own culture, because we too, of course, are a product of our own history. So when I said that climate was not caused by the world, but by a particular worldview, that's our worldview. And it's not a bad worldview. It gave us a scientific method. It gave us allopathic medicine. It did allow us to put a man on the moon. But if we look back at the genesis of our way of thinking, even if we just go as far as the Enlightenment, but before, to the Renaissance, we were desperate to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith. And so when Descartes said all that existed is mind and matter, in a single gesture, he de-animated the world. As Saul Bellow would say, science would make a house cleaning of belief. And we threw out all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, but critically also metaphor. And so the idea that the flight of a bird could have meaning, that a mountain could be a deity, that a forest could be the abode of spirits, was ridiculed by Western way of thinking. And this reduction of the world to a mechanism, with nature as an obstacle to be overcome, a resource to be exploited, has really in good measure determined the way that we interact with the living planet. I was raised, for example, on the coast of British Columbia to believe that the rainforest existed to be cut. That was the basis of the scientific ideology of forestry that I learned in school, and I practiced as a logger in the woods. I was a forestry engineer and a logger. That's how I paid for college. And that attitude made me profoundly different from my Kwakwaka'wakw friends or my Haida friends who were raised to believe that the forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven, the cannibal spirits that would have to be embraced in the Hamatsa initiation so that moral order could be brought back to the world. Now, the point, of course, isn't to say what perspective is right or wrong. Is a forest mere cellulose and board feet? Is the domain of spirits? Does a river really follow the ancestral path of an anaconda? Who is to say? But ultimately, what matters is the potency of the belief, the manner in which the conviction plays out in the day-to-day lives of a people. For in a very real sense, that determines their ecological footprint. And so a child raised to believe that a mountain is the abode of a protective deity will have a profoundly different human a sense of things than someone raised as I was to believe it's simply a pile of rock waiting to be mined. And the full measure of a culture, of course, embraces not just the actions of a people, but the quality of their aspirations, the nature of the metaphors that propel them forward. And I think that's when we talk, and there's so much talk about indigenous people and their relationship to the land, but it often falls into kind of the realm of kind of, Rousseauian noble savage, ecological native. And what's really going on is so much more profound than that. Mountains, rivers, and forests are simply not perceived to be inanimate, like mere props on a stage set upon which only the human drama unfolds. For all the societies that I've known in all of my travels, the land is alive, a dynamic force to be embraced and transformed by the human imagination. Everywhere, reciprocity, not extraction, is the norm, some basic iteration of the fact that just as the earth owes its bounty to humans, humans in turn owe their fidelity to the earth. In indigenous cultures, the Arhuacos in particular, people are never the problem. We're the only solution, because it's through our rituals and prayers that we can give form to the genius and the beauty and the divinity of La Madre Creadora. And so this idea of reciprocity is not a romantic intuition. This is simply the way that these cultures have lived for most of their histories. So if we go, for example, into the high Andes, and we suddenly recognize this relationship and the mediation of the sacred plant coca. Coca is to cocaine what potatoes are to vodka. This is a plant that's been used for 8,000 years with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction. One of the most interesting things about the whole saga of coca is that the efforts to eradicate traditional fields in South America began 50 years before there was a cocaine hydrochloride problem. It had nothing to do with that drug and everything to do with the cultural identity of the people that revered the plant. Physicians in Lima in the 1920s looked up in the Andes and they saw social pathologies, illiteracy, poor sanitation, bad health, and there had to be a cause. And because issues of inequity, injustice, land distribution challenged too closely the bourgeois foundations of their own lives in Lima, they settled on coca. And they blamed coca for every single ill, including those who refused to accept the domination of the civilized part of the society. That's a quote from a health official. And during all those 50 years, they never bothered to do a nutritional study of the plant, even though it was used every day by millions of peoples throughout the Andean region and the Northwest Amazon. And when we finally did a nutritional study in 1975 for the USDA, what we discovered horrified our backers at the American government. We found out that coca had a tiny amount of alkaloid in it, roughly analogous to the amount of caffeine in a coffee bean, and no one noticed the irony that at every drug war conference, the DE agents bolted for the coffee pot at 10 o'clock in the morning. But in addition to that, it was chock full of vitamins, proteins, nutrients. It had more calcium than any plant ever studied by science, which made it perfect for a traditional diet that lacked a dairy product. It had enzymes that enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation. This really was the divine leaf of immortality. But more important than that is nothing can happen culturally that is not mediated by the sacred cycle of the plant. When you meet in the Andes on the trail, you don't shake hands, you exchange leaves. You take 3 perfect leaves, offer them to your companion, who then blows, as Geronimo is blowing, the essence of the plant, puke, back to the apus, the deities, so that just as the rain condenses in the clouds to bring more fertility to the soil, so the energy of the plant goes back to the divine apus to bring well-being to the community. You can say that only by participating in halpai, the whole process, the ritual of using this sacred plant, can you be runakuna of the Andes. And so to deny the people of the Andes this plant it's not like denying the Germans beer or the people in Turkey coffee or betel nut to the Indonesians. To deny the indigenous people of the Americas coca is an act of cultural genocide. And there's no question whatsoever about that. But this idea of reciprocity, what makes it so beautiful is the way it plays out in ritual. Once each year in the community of Chinchero, right outside of Cusco, the fastest young boy in every hamlet is given the honor of becoming a woman. And he puts on the clothing of his sister or his mother, and he becomes a huaylaca, which in Quechua means a kind of transvestite. And he must lead all able-bodied men on a run, but it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet, run 1,000 feet down to the base of Antiquilca, and then you run to 16,000 feet, only to fall away on the far side of the Sacred Valley and to cross 2 more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a long 24-hour ritual day. At the entire circumference of the community lands is the race is where you go. And it's marked by these mounds of earth, itos, mojones, where the huaylaca must spin to bring the energy of the feminine to the mountaintop, where coca is given to Pachamama, libations of alcohol to the wind. And the metaphor is so beautiful. You go into the mountain as an individual, but through exhaustion and sacrifice in Latin means to make sacred, you emerge as a single pulse, having once again each year reaffirmed your sense of ownership of the land, but more importantly, your obligation to that land. And as my wife says, in one of my many midlife crises, at the age of 48, I did this race, and I was the only man to do it and the oldest outsider to do it. And I only got through by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 8,000-year history of the plant. But what really got me through is that over 40 years, I baptized dozens of ahijados. I had so many godchildren, and I put them all through school, bought cows for their family and pencils and school books. And when my ahijados found out that their padrino was stupid enough to run the movimiento at 48, they came out and they clung to me like limpets through the entire race. They would not let anything happen to their cash cow. But these localized rituals become pan-Andean in these great events like the Coyariti, where once each year, in the shadow of the most sacred mountain of the Inca, Osangati, in a valley what most of the year is just empty, save for the odd shepherd, as many as 40,000 pilgrims converge from all over the southern Andes, just as the Pleiades reemerge in the sky. Some arrive on foot, some by mule, others in open trucks, and they make their way up a trail that climbs for roughly 10 kilometers, a route that is marked by altars and cairns, a station of the cross, where men and women stop to pray and make offerings. Each carries a bundle of small stones, which one by one you lessen your load as you move up. And it falls to the ritual specialist to do the most solemn act of the Coyariti. Like Christ himself, they shoulder a terrible burden, carrying the crosses from the community churches up into the glaciers of the Colcapunca, where they're implanted in the ice to be charged by the energy of the mountain and the earth. And then before dawn on the morning of the 3rd day, even as down below tens of thousands of women kneel with candles in prayer, they return to the mountain, bound together by whips, to retrieve the crosses. And then as all eyes are on the summit, they bring the crosses back, renewed for another year. And so as the sun comes up, the crosses come down and they make their way on the backs of the pilgrims through the Sinicara and out into the trucks and back to the villages. They also carry from the mountain small blocks of ice, which completes the devotional cycle. The people go to the mountain, the essence of the mountain returns to the village to bring fertility to the fields, well-being to the families, health to the animals. So this is pilgrimage through sacred geography, homage to the gods. It becomes effectively a collective prayer for the well-being of the entire Pan-Andean world. Now, I was lucky enough to be raised in British Columbia in a kind of modest family. So I always worked in the bush as fighting forest fires. I was a logger, also as a hunting guide, park ranger. And I was lucky enough to get a job that only our socialist government could possibly create. They made this huge wilderness park the size of Connecticut, roadless utterly without having any idea what was in it. So I was hired as the first park ranger. My job description was deliciously vague: wilderness assessment and public relations. And in 2 4-month seasons, I saw 12 people. So there was no one to reluct. But I became very close in these wanderings to this remarkable. Let's see. I think we've got something going on here. Right? Let's see. There we go. Maybe this word. To this remarkable elder, Atahena, a Gitsan elder. We forget how wild Canada is. Until the building of the Panama Canal, the coast of British Columbia, where I live, was about as far from Europe as you could go. So at a time when the Amazon had been settled for 400 years and Bogota was at least 350 years old, Europeans hadn't reached the coast of British Columbia. So old man Alec, who would stay with me until he died, was 43 years old before he had sustained contact with white people. And he was a really extraordinary character. He didn't come from a tradition of literacy. His soul had not been crushed in the residential schools. He was a hunter, and his very vocabulary was inspired by the sounds of the wild. Just as we can hear the voice of a character when we read a novel, so too Alex would hear the voices of animals. And when he told a story, he did so in a way that the listener actually witnessed and experienced the essence of the tale, entering the narrative and becoming transfixed by all the syllables of nature. Every telling was a moment of renewal, a chance to engage in the very dance of the universe. Many of the stories were of moral fortitude, of an anthropomorphic figure called Weekett, who was like the trickster, the coyote, always teaching people how to live by the example of his follies. Alex spoke 7 languages, and he spoke English as you would imagine one would speak a language with care. He never spoke ill of the wind. He would never say you're not supposed to hurt an animal because a hunter must kill an animal to live. He would say you must not suffer an animal because suffer implies humiliation. When he hunted, he spoke to the prey by name with praise and admiration. His grandmother was Cree, possessed of the medicine power, certain that language had been given to human beings from the animals. And as a carrier elder explained to the great anthropologist Diogenes, we know what the animals do. We know what their needs are. We were taught by the animals themselves. The priests say that we lie, but we know better. The white man writes everything down in a book so that it will not be forgotten. But our ancestors married animals, learned all their ways, and passed on this knowledge from one generation to another. I once asked Alec how long the cycle of tales was. It was a question that Alex had put to his own father many years ago. And to find out, they had put on their snowshoes in March, a time of good ice, and begun to walk from one end of Bear Lake all the way to another, telling the story as they went along. And as they got all the way there, all the way back, and as Alex said, story not even halfway done. But here's the wonderful metaphor. To measure the duration of a sacred tale, you don't set a timepiece. You move through sacred geography, telling the story as you went along. Well, if we slip to one of the most ancient civilizations, we know from studies of the Y chromosome, the first peoples to walk out of the ancient continent of Africa, we reached the most parsimonious continent of all, and that is, of course, Australia. And when human beings reached Australia, they went walking. And in time, they established 10,000 clan territories, all bound together by the song lines, the tracks followed by the ancestral beings when they sang the universe into existence at the time of the rainbow serpent. And as the Aboriginal people today trace the song lines and chant the stories of the first dawning, they enter dream time, which is neither a dream nor the passage of time. It is the very realm of the ancestors, a parallel universe where the ordinary laws of time, space, motion do not apply, where past, future, and present merge into one. In not one of the 670 dialects and languages of Australia was there a word for past, present, or future, or time. And to walk the song lines is to become part of the ongoing creation of the world, a place that both exists and is still waiting to be formed. Thus, the Aboriginal people are not just attached to the land, they are essential to its existence. Because without the land, they would die. But without the people, the earth would wither. And should the rituals stop, the voices fall silent, all would be lost, because everything on earth is held together by the song lines, just as everything is subordinate to the dreaming, which is constant but ever-changing. Every landmark is wedded to a memory of its origin, and yet always in the process of being born. Every animal resonates with the pulse of an ancient event while still being dreamed into being. The land is encoded with everything that has ever been, everything that ever will be, in every dimension of reality. The world is perfect, and yet at the same time constantly being reimagined and renewed. And thus to walk the song line and to honor the rainbow serpent is to engage in a constant act of affirmation, an endless dance of creation. Now, when the British washed ashore in Australia, they encountered a people that looked strange, that had a simple material technology, but what really offended the British is the Aboriginal peoples had no interest in progress. And because progress was the very ethos of Europe during the late 18th century, the time of settlement, the British, in their inimitable way, concluded the Aboriginal people weren't human, and they began to shoot them. As recently as 1902, in the lifetime of my grandfather, it was debated in Melbourne in Parliament as to whether or not Aboriginal people were human. As recently as the 1950s, ranchers in Australia had quotas as to how many abos could be shot with impunity who trespassed upon their ranches. As recently as the 1960s, a school book used across the curricula of the country, A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, included the Aboriginal people as interesting forms of wildlife. And what was in fact missing was the ability of the Europeans to appreciate this extraordinarily subtle devotional philosophy. Not just are the people being essential to the land, but without the people and their rituals, the earth would wither. The entire purpose of life in Australia was not to change anything. There was no idealization of the notion of progress. Quite to the opposite, the ethos was stasis. The purpose of life was to maintain the world exactly as it was at the time of its creation. It would be like if all of Western science had been focused on pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was at the time of Adam and Eve's fateful conversation. The goal wasn't to change anything. It was to keep the world as it was. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that had humanity as a whole followed that devotional philosophy, yes, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon, but we wouldn't be sitting here in New York in Climate Week speaking about the consequences of climate change and our ability to transform the life supports of the planet. Well, if we move into the Amazon of Colombia, and we remember that when Caspar de Cabral and Aureliana went down the Amazon in 1541, they didn't encounter an empty forest. There were millions and millions of people living in the Amazon basin. And our vision of life in the Amazon has been overly impacted by our obsession with the fate of the Amazon and also by our sense of how fragile it is to live in the Amazon when it wasn't. And our view of indigenous life has been overly focused through the lens of the so-called marginal societies, not marginal in the sense of being marginal literally geographically, those who survived the Holocaust, insulated from the west by the Andean Cordillera and from the east by geography and cataracts. These are the societies like the Kofan, the Yanomami, the Shimane in Bolivia, and these tend to be small societies living endogenously, marrying amongst themselves, often like the Waorani, traditionally in open conflict with their neighbors. But what was going on in the Amazon was something quite different. And when we see in this complex of peoples that we sometimes call the peoples of the Anaconda, we're talking about the Dasana, the Barasana, the Makuna, the Tanimukos, the Tucanos, the Bara, even the Carijonas, who are kind of different, all in this amazing area of the Amazon of Colombia, which, by the way, is the most beautiful section of the entire Amazon basin. It's an area the size of France, threatened in ways now, but still essentially roadless. This is paradise on earth. And it's also the homeland of a complex of people who were not in conflict with their neighbors. They had social structures that facilitated peace, not war, not the least of which was a marriage rule that said you had to marry someone who spoke another language. So in any one longhouse, you have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but you never hear a child practicing a different tongue. They simply begin to speak at the appropriate time. And the most profound insight or intuition of the Barasana and the Makuna, who incidentally believe mythologically they came up the Milk River from the east in the belly of the sacred serpent, only to be regurgitated on the various rivers of the northwest Amazon. That is the mythological foundation of the linguistic exogamy, because every canoe left a people on a river, and so if you came up in the same canoe, if you marry amongst your own language, you're committing incest. And that's a mythological rationale to emphasize this interconnection through the immense forest. But their most profound intuition is the fact that plants and animals are but people in another dimension of reality. Mythology infuses land and life with meaning. Rituals reinforce the norms that drive social behavior, encoding expectations and behaviors that are essential to survival in the forest. There is no separation between nature and culture. Without the forests and the rivers, humans would perish. Without people, the natural world would have no order or meaning. I mean, that is the essence of the mythological tale of the great mother, Romikumu, whose menstrual blood sort of came out, and then the 4 Iowa, the great thunders, came up and found the world a completely shattered place, and with their power and beauty, they recreated the world, maintained its harmony, and to this day, humans have that obligation to precisely that. And maintaining this flow of generative energy, fomenting reciprocity among all forms of life, is the duty of the shaman, who is neither a priest nor a physician. In fact, Barasana shaman don't even deal with medicinal plants. The shaman for the Barasana is a diplomat in constant dialogue with the spirit realm. He has all the responsibilities of a nuclear engineer who must periodically go to the very heart of the reactor to reprogram the world. And the shaman moves at ease through mystical dimensions unseen by ordinary eyes, but familiar to the Barasana and Makuna, who say that they see with their minds. And so in ritual ceremonies that embrace the entire community, the men come together to ingest yahe, this remarkable potion that serves as a portal to the divine. And so by day, as they don the ritual regalia, the yellow corona of pure thought, the white egret plumes of the rain, they become not symbols of the ancestors, they literally become the ancestors. And they relive their mythic journeys. They recite by memory 1,800 toponyms of sites that were encountered in mythological time on the journey up the Amazon from the east, even though no Barasana has replicated that journey in generations. And so as they take on the regalia, relive the mythic journeys, alight on all the sacred sites, they transcend every form, becoming as if a single pulse of pure energy flowing through all creation. And so shamanic sanctions and cosmologies, as we actually deconstruct them and study them, we suddenly see to our astonishment that what actually emerges is nothing less than an incredibly sophisticated land management plan that dictated precisely the way that people in great numbers could live in that forest without bringing it to waste. Well, if we go now to the homeland of the ambassador the extraordinary Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. You know, Colombia is the most incredible country in the world. It's the most beautiful country in the world. It's the most diverse country, but it gets better than that. There is no place in Colombia more than 1 day's travel from every known ecological niche on the planet. And okay, that's great, but take this. Now you go to the Sierra Nevada. There is no place in the Sierra Nevada, this isolated massif that soars to 20,000 feet out of the Caribbean coastal plain, the highest coastal mountain range on Earth. It is the embodiment of the planet, because there everything can be found as well, including 4 extraordinary survivors of El Dorado, the Cancuano, the Wiwa, the Kogi, and the Arhuacos. Descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization, which once covered the Caribbean coastal plain. In the wake of the conquest, a particularly bitter conquest, the survivors retreated. And in the mountains, they reinvented themselves as a devotional culture of peace. And that is not hippie ethnography either. They remain true to this day. It's incredible. I mean, only in Colombia could this happen 500 years after conquest. The sun priests, the mamos of the Arhuacos are still there, still looking down at the very beaches where Columbus's men landed on the third voyage, still there to inform us, the younger brother, to change our ways. They are the elder brothers. To this day, they're ruled by a ritual priesthood. The training for the priesthood is austere in the extreme. The young acolytes are taken away from their families, not taken away at the age of 2 and 3, and they're raised by the mamo and the protection of the priest. And in all that time, they never leave the environs of the sacred temple. The world kind of exists as an abstraction, as they're taught the intense religiosity of the belief system, which rivals anything of the Tibetans have developed in their cosmic worldview in the Himalaya. Like the peoples of the southern Peru, they revere Hayo, a different species, cultivated, domesticated species. This is Erythroxylon novagranatense. That was Erythroxylon coca. But here's the amazing thing about that story. Both these domesticated species and the 2 subspecies are all derived from the same wild ancestor, Erythroxylon gracilipes, a wild coca which grows all the way around the eastern flanks of the Cordillera from Venezuela south to Bolivia. And so what you have here is separate domestication of a sacred plant that would be revered at both ends of the continuum over the course of 8,000 years, almost unprecedented in the history of plant domestication. Hayo is the essence of life. Men in the Sierra will consume a pound of leaves a day. There is a constant reverence for the plant. The training for the priest occurs often at night in the darkness. And then this is where it gets extraordinary. After the acolyte has completed 18 years of training, at the age of 21, 22, 23, whatever he is, or he will then go on a pilgrimage through the High Sierra. And just to say, this is not vestigial, this is not ancient, this is happening right now. This is a photograph I took 2 months ago on pilgrimage in the Sierra. And the acolyte then goes from the temple to the heights of Saranqua, the Madre Creadora. And then offerings are made of objects from the sea, brought to the ice, and then from the ice brought back to the sea. Pagamentos made by the women at the mouth of the Rio Magdalena, in the heart of the 3rd biggest city of Colombia, Barranquilla. And as Mamo Camilo said to me, and I was able to pass on to President Santos at one point, and he used it in a speech that was broadcast across the nation. Mamo Camilo said, "La paz no vale nada si es solamente una manera en que los varios lados de conflicto pueden unificarse para mantener una guerra contra la naturaleza. Tenemos que hacer paz contra la naturaleza." He said, peace won't matter at all if it's just an excuse for the 3 sides to come together to maintain a war against nature. It's time for us to make peace with the entire natural world. The Arhuacos make no distinction between the water that flows down a river and the blood that runs through our veins. They see a direct relationship between urine, blood, saliva, tears, and the water of a river, lake, wetland, or lagoon. And in this, if you think about it, they're undoubtedly correct. Humans are born of water, a cocoon of comfort in a mother's womb. Even as adults, most of our body is made up of water. Compress the bones, ligaments, muscles, and sinew, the plates and cells of our body, of our blood, and the rest of us, 2/3 of our weight, would flow as readily to the ocean as a river to the sea. And so imbuing water, for example, with an idea of the sacred isn't contrary to science, but rather an acknowledgement of the complexity and wonder of ecological and biological systems that science alone has illuminated. Now, we have still this idea that these cultures are somehow quaint and colorful, but destined to fade away, as if they're failed attempts at being modern, failed attempts at to keep up. Nothing could be further from the truth. Technology is never a threat to culture. Change is never a threat to culture. What is a threat to culture is power. In every case, these are living, dynamic peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. Years ago, I went to live with the nomadic Panan in Sarawak while they were suffering the highest rate of deforestation in the world. These were the last nomadic hunters and gatherers of Southeast Asia. They lived in the most extraordinary way. Sharing was a reflexive response. I once gave a cigarette to an old woman and watched as she tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably in the encampment, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. You share because you never know who will be the next to bring food to the table. It's an oral tradition, so the language is encoded in the vocabulary and knowledge of the best storyteller. And the flight of a bird becomes a cursive script of nature, like a vocabulary written on the wind. But by the time I got there, the sounds of the forest had become machinery. The rivers that once ran clear were so laden with silt that it seemed as if half of Borneo was slipping away to the South China Sea. Children raised in the forest were suddenly in settlement camps, suffering from new forms of disease. Men completely humiliated, standing up, blowpipes against bulldozers, but no match for the power of the Malaysian state. So in my one lifetime, I saw a people morally inspired, inherently right, with so much to teach us about the world and their world, simply crushed along with the forest that had given them birth. And it's strange. None of this, of course, is to suggest that any of us return to a non-industrial past or that any culture be asked to forfeit its right to benefit from the genius of technology. It's not the traditional versus a modern. It's the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. And it's also for the rest of us to draw inspiration and comfort from the fact that the path that we have taken is not inevitable and the only one available, and that our destiny is therefore not indelibly written in a set of choices that demonstrably and scientifically have proven not to be wise. By the very existence, not of indigenous cultures, these aren't indigenous people. Indigenous is a generic, it's no different to say non-indigenous and indigenous is no real different, primitive and civilized. Indigenous is fine, but we shouldn't bury all these voices of humanity in an anonymous sea of indigeneity. I don't think of the Arawakos as being indigenous. They're Arawako. I'm 70 years old. I'm older than 100 nations in the United Nations. The Haida have occupied Haida Gwaii for 10,000 years. These aren't like a miasma of indigeneity. These are nations with names and to be honored by their names. And the main important thing is that the existence of these different visions of life puts a lie to those of us who say that we cannot change as we really know we must, the fundamental way that we inhabit the planet. Asik Nilik, one of the headmen of the Penang, once asked me in the middle of a thunderstorm, whether it was true that we had really gone to the moon. And then I said, yes. He said, why did you bother to go? And it struck me a pretty interesting question. Obviously, we went for that vision of Earth from space, and that was an illumination. But at the same time, it is kind of weird that we send these probes into space to try to find evidence of water on Mars or the moons of Jupiter, while we meanwhile, ruin the limited fresh water we have on our blue planet. If one of these orbs that Elon Musk is sending up came back with evidence of one form of organic sentient life, the headlines would explode all around the world. It's crazy. We live on a planet of billions of forms of sentient life. Why do we need to go into space? And the answer is also, it's not a one-way street. If human beings are in fact the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. And this once again brings me back to Colombia, a country that's done as much for indigenous people, and there I go, I'm using the same word, as any other nation on earth. I'd say more. In 1985, in 1970s, when I went to live with the Barasana in the Northwest Amazon, it felt like a very sad place where something important had happened a long time ago. The rubber trade, the power of the missionaries, many of them North American. It was really kind of a sad place. And then something incredible happened. President Virgilio Barco in 1985 said to an old friend of mine, Martin von Hildebrand, an anthropologist here on the left, to do something for the Indians. That's all he said. And in less than 5 incredible years, Martin did more than something. He secured legal land tenure for an area of land collectively the size of the United Kingdom for the 57 ethnicities of the Northwest Amazon. And behind a veil of isolation created by the trauma and the conflict of modern Colombia, an entire new dream of culture was born. When I went back some years later, this man on the right, Stephen Hugh Jones, head of anthropology at Cambridge, who worked with the Barasana for years and had predicted, sadly, their demise in a BBC strand of films called Disappearing Worlds in the late 1970s. He walked into the longhouse where there were 250 men and women in total ritual regalia, taking yahe, celebrating cassava woman. And he went out and grabbed a satellite phone, called his wife in London and said, "Christine, you won't believe my eyes. The only thing that disappeared were the bloody missionaries." And so this is the rebirth of culture, the Rock of Knee, the sacred site. And again, this really then is the story. And so as we consider some of these things, let's just remember that with climate, the first thing we should ask any policymaker, any politician, is to recite the formula for photosynthesis. And if they can't do that, they don't get my vote. Remember that a carbon-free grid won't fulfill its promise if it only energizes practices that continue to destroy the natural world. My city of Vancouver has, with great fanfare, pledged to get to net zero by 2030, even while the province of British Columbia colludes with industry to cut 65 million metric meters of timber every year. In the boreal forest, the greatest carbon sink on the planet, we are cutting from Siberia to Saskatchewan hundreds of thousands of acres every year, all in Canada to make 2-ply toilet paper. So if we really want to find this new possibility, we should remember something that Tom Lovejoy said. Anyone who thinks that economy trumps ecology should try counting their money with a plastic bag tied around their head. And one final quick anecdote, and I know I've gone on too long, but it's too precious a story. Martin von Hildebrand arranged a cultural exchange between Colombia and Qatar. 3 princes of the emir went to the Colombian Amazon for 3 weeks and hated every minute of it. And then 3 shamans from the Barasana and Macuna went to Doha. And I was there when I arrived, and Pacho, Martin's son, had dressed them up as kind of like a bad mariachi band with these guayaberas and these straw hats and everything. And we went falcon hunting with our host that day. And all afternoon, the shaman got sadder and sadder and sadder. And when they went back to Bogota 3 weeks later, they went to see Martin, and Martin said, "¿Cómo fue? How was it?" "Terrible. Fue terrible. Más terrible que terrible." And so Martin said, "What was the problem?" He says, "Esa gente allá son tan pobres, la única cosa que tiene es la plata." Those people over there are so poor, all they've got is money, because there were no lakes, no rivers, and no forests. And that, my friends, is what Colombia has in abundance. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Davis. That was an incredible start to the day. We're so grateful to hear your wisdom. Before we break, I have the distinct privilege of welcoming and introducing Susana Muhammad, the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development for the Republic of Colombia. She is joined also today by the Colombian Consul General, Andres Mejia. Minister Muhammad is the former Director for Climate Action Planning for Latin America in the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group and served as Secretary of the Environment and General Secretary of the Mayor's Office in Bogota. Her visit today is fitting on two fronts. Firstly, we are gearing up here at NYBG to take part in the 16th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP16, which is taking place next month in Cali, Colombia. We congratulate Minister Muhammad on her country's leadership in serving as the host for this most important gathering. And of course, as you've heard today already, Colombia is among the most biodiverse and important countries in the natural world. And so we're so grateful to welcome you here today and invite you to say a few words.
Thank you so much. There's not much to say after listening to Mr. Davis. So I will only like to use this opportunity to invite you to COP16. In these times of uncertainty, in these times of war, in these times where the only circle that you can perceive is further loss in democracy, further loss in habitats, ecosystems, and thus more incapacity to govern and more conflict emerging. And the response continues to be this very high inequality, the capitalistic machine really moving forward, but actually without any capacity of regulation, and the systematic destruction of life on Earth. There needs to be at least a point of reflection, a place of light, a moment where something can emerge. And from the Colombian government, we are quite certain that that movement exists, that people all around the world are already making a difference. People are looking how to live within this crisis and are finding new ways and responses to that challenge. And that there is other value systems, as Mr. Davis already shows us, that are there still, and that we will need to transcend this crisis if we are to transcend it in this 21st century, all the wisdom of humanity and all of the experience of humanity in diversity. From that perspective, for the Colombian government, COP16 has three main political objectives beyond, of course, the objectives of the parties' negotiation, which are ultimately important as working on reaching consensus and trying to move forward common agendas of humanity. But one of those is actually the call to make peace with nature. And that has become the calling from Colombia, which wants to launch a multi-stakeholder Peace with Nature coalition, which at its fundamental is proposing a shift of understanding and a shift of perception of our relationship with nature. It is not casual that actually we will be launching the concept Peace with Nature with the four peoples from the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, from one of their sacred places to the world. as we really conceive that is in that shift of understanding our relationship with nature, that we could find new ways of putting that question in everything we do in the modern world. What does it mean to have a productive process that makes peace with nature? What it means to have education that makes peace with nature? What does it mean to have an economy that makes peace with nature? What is a government and a governance system that makes peace with nature? The second objective is to actually position politically that biodiversity and actually life and its intrinsic value, its protection, its conservation, but also its sustainable use are as important in the climate transition as decarbonization and the energy transition, which politically right now has much more importance and is of a higher value because it's attached more to the business, which runs actually this capitalist machine. So putting on the other side of the coin the awareness that if we are not able to work with nature as our main ally to transcend, hopefully, this crisis, then we will not have a future even if we decarbonize, or that actually the energy transition and the decarbonization can be at the expense of nature and can be actually, again, another cycle of inequality and human rights violation. And actually, human rights and the protection of peoples are at the center of the transition, or the transition will not be, or it will not be for everybody, as the UN Charter tries to pursue. So we need to be able to make visible this movement of protection of nature and sustainable use, because it will also put a lot of political pressure on decarbonization. The impacts of climate change are being felt by peoples, but also nature is in the process of transition and adaptation. We need to understand how is it do it. It could be a teacher, it could be an ally, or actually we could ignore it and destroy it in the process towards this green transition, which could be as damaging as the carbon era. And finally, we would like this to be the People's Cup. And the Colombian government is being serious about this. We have created, through a participatory process, more than 900 events that will happen in the city of Cali during the 2 weeks of COP16 in the largest green zone that has been done for a biodiversity COP. These events have been self-created in a participatory way. 42% of those will be on social movements, indigenous peoples, campesinos, and Afro-descendant communities. 17% will be on the private sector, and 17% have been proposed by international agencies. There is also a route of influence between the green zone and the blue zone, and the high-level segment where ministers will sit to discuss this issue will be multi-stakeholder, because we want to mobilize the principle that this transformation needs whole of society and whole of governance. And especially the Colombian presidency will be very much interested in 4 themes, but one of those will be actually the approval of the program of work for indigenous peoples. We are also supporting the pledge for territorial rights around the world, and they are going to have, with Afro-descendants and campesinos, a very important voice and platform that has been guaranteed by the host country. So with all of this, I'm not less than to invite you all to Cali. The scientific community has also a very important place. We are working with IPBES, IPCC, and also the resource report from UNEP, so that we have a synthesis report of the reality of the planet and hopefully inspire all actors. Even if the negotiations goes well or doesn't go well, I don't know. We hope the parties come to decisions. The most important thing for us is the mobilization platform, and we invite you all to be part of it. So welcome to Cali, and hopefully we can sparkle a process to make back peace with nature.